And ready to roll. Okay, so we didn't quite finish last week's lecture, and the reason was a discussion the JP stimulated. So I thought I should start by carrying on with that conversation. And you, JP, you gave your mental model of a single borrower, and the bank defers interest payments for 10 years. And then where's the money going to come from to pay the interest when the deferral turns off? Okay. Well, Minsky's course is designed. I've been burping. I've just ate a very hot Chinese meal, so I'll be burping a bit for a while. Because Minsky has designed to model an entire economy. It's top-down model. That's the way I prefer to think. So I've actually modeled what you suggested, top-down. Okay. So the idea is the banking sector defers interest payments for 10 years to everybody. Okay. We have an outstanding amount. I haven't bothered changing the amount of money. So there's an outstanding amount of money that's been loaned out, which is equal to $100 million, billion dollars, but 100 will do. And the depositors have deposits of 70 million, billion, whatever the unit is, and the banks have 30. Okay, so the banks are 30% of the economy, and the non-financial is 70%, which isn't too far from the actual situation. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and let's see what happens. Can you all? I'll just put the controls out of the way in a second. Okay, so you can all see that. Bit of checking in. Hang on. Can you all see that model there?
Yes.
Reasonable resolution. Okay, let's run it. So what I've got here, paying interest, and that's deferred interest, hasn't been paid so far. So what you have, outstanding loans of 100. Interest rate is 5, so the annual payments are $5 million, whatever, per year. And if you don't pay it, then that goes into deferred interest. So you have 0 deferred interest to start with. And then what you have is the difference between what you're supposed to pay and what you have paid is unpaid interest. So that accumulates over time. And then at the year 10, you start paying. Okay. And then you stop paying when your unpaid interest falls down to 0 again. Oh, run the model. What happens? So the economy holds together. People overpay the money back. Why? And I'll go back a bit. You can actually run the simulation reverse in Minsky. I haven't actually tried doing this as a demo before. Look at can you see the 2 little dots there? Which are the current points of the simulation? You can't, Cliff. It's too small.
I don't know where you're pointing with your mouse.
You're down here. Mouse.
Oh, yeah, yes, I can see that.
Okay. Let's run it backwards for a while. So what happens over time is it's actually not running very accurately, I've got to say. Whoops. Let's go back and I'll go the other direction now. I'll make it more slowly. And this is why I say you've got to think in a system sense, JP, because what you thought about was the interest has been deferred. What you didn't think about what that means is banks aren't earning any income, but they're still doing spending. So the banks spend for that length of time. What happens is most of the 30, and in fact in the simulation almost all of the 30, gets transferred across to the depositors. Then they've got to pay it back, but rather than having 70 and having to pay 50 that they don't have, they've got up virtually 100. And the cash flow dynamics, even during the payback, means they manage to pay it back. Let's just do it more slowly now. What you have is deposit accounts for the arising 75, 76, 77, the bank's falling because it's not getting any income coming in. And therefore it's spending less and less over time, but more and more of the money is turning up in the bank accounts of the borrowers. And then when you get to the point where I'll speed it up a bit here, when you hit the 10-year mark, where you start paying, I'll wait till it gets to the 10 before I slow it down again. Suddenly, the income, notice what happens there. This is what's called a step function. The payments go from $0 per year to $50 per year. That's what's outstanding at a particular time. And therefore, because you paid nothing for 10 years, you're going to have to pay 50 per year at this point. But as you pay it, you're spending it, you're paying it, but the banks are now spending more because they've suddenly got money to spend back on you again. So that counteracts the difference between, like, as you start with 70, you might think you've got 120 to pay, and you are paying at the rate that would mean if it kept it up, you'd pay 120. You pay 50 over the years, so it's 70 plus 50, 120, you've only got 100. But what is going on is there's a step function, a dramatic increase in the amount you're spending. Banks are now spending, they're about to spend $10 per year on you. So the cash flow from them spending again compensates for the fact that you haven't got 120, and you keep on going for a while. And what's the deferred interest there? The unpaid interest is equal to the deferred interest. You started paying at $50 per year. Now you're paying at $31 per year. Keep it going. 30, 28, 25, blah, 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 blah. And you get down to the stage ultimately where you're paying $5 per year again. And your bank, although wait till it gets back to the $5 per year point. So once it hits 5, it'll stabilize at that point.
Why are we doing this?
Pardon?
Why are we doing this?
Oh, because last week JP raised a very commonly believed point that because banks lend money and then you've got to pay back money plus the interest, you don't have enough money, and therefore you've got to continue borrowing money to be able to continue paying the interest. And that is a fallacy. And the fallacy comes from what you're doing is you're talking about a debt you owe, which is denominated in dollars, versus an income stream, which is dollars per year. And people simply add the two together, and that's mathematically valid. And JP gave an example where, what if banks defer it for 10 years so you don't pay any interest? You accumulate, and that's what happens with the unpaid interest here. Because you have paid nothing for 10 years, by the time you start repaying it, you owe $50. You started with 70, and you've now got to pay 50. Well, you've still got, you don't look like you've got enough money to handle it. But it's the systemic effect. The banks are spending on you. If I said there's no spending by banks, that'd be a deep trouble. Okay, then you'd get no money coming in. The bank, there'd be no extra money turning up. You have to pay for more money when it was necessary. You'd have a deep problem relatively. But even that, I think most likely you'd survive. So the whole argument that you can't repay debt because you've got to pay interest on the debt plus the principal is wrong. Now, JP, any reactions?
Yeah, I'm a little bit saddened you went to all this effort to.
Oh, your sound is bad. JP, your sound is very bad. Can you lean towards your microphone?
It's with the earbuds. Can you hear me or not?
I can hear you now. You've just got to be very close to your mic. Is your microphone on your laptop, which is a very poor sound, and I've got bad hearing as well, which doesn't help.
Okay.
Are there the microphones up there? Is it?
I think it's here. Yeah.
Okay. Just speak.
Slowly.
Just speak. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit sad that you went to the trouble of making this nice example, but it's still based on interest payment. It's just the interest payment is happening a little later. It's deferred, right? And so it's the same system based on interest, which I was at peace with at the end of last lecture. And
oh, good. Okay.
yeah. So everything's fine.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Well, the main point is just to illustrate the importance of thinking systemically about anything, and that's what this illustrates. And it was actually a nice example for me to work on, so I don't mind the time that I spent at all. And that's partly what this whole lecture series is about, anyway. So I'm happy to have done it. So that's basically illustrations. So I'll get back to the lecture. I think I'm just trying to remember where I got to in the previous week before we had that conversation. Did I get to the point of Graziani on money? Roughly right? That's Tony telling me that there. Okay, so I'll carry on. So I think I got to this point of talking about, and I'll put it up on screen, the triangular idea. I think that's I wouldn't have got this inspiration without reading Augusto Graziani. So I've linked to Graziani in the materials for the course. I'm too flat out to have actually got the materials updated for a long time. But if you search for Augusto Graziani and the monetary theory of production, there's a 1989 paper in what's called the Thames Papers on Political Economy, where he first set the argument out. And it's beautiful logic. And having read that, that's what led to me designing Minsky. Interestingly enough, out of the blue, during the week, I got approached by two of my good Italian economist friends, Giuseppe Fontana and Riccardo Bellafiore. What a wonderful name. Riccardo Bellafiore, this beautifully musical name. And they're giving a tribute conference to Augusto in Rome early next year. And they haven't invited me to come along and speak because of all the COVID issues, but still on travel. I might actually fly there if I can, but I'll still be working here in Budapest. But they've asked me to record a dedication about the influence Augusto had on me. So I'll be talking mainly about this vision, the triangular vision, leading to the fact that I can now explain monetary dynamics using Minsky, which really, I have to attribute the idea to him. So it really was, as I say here, and no joke, the serious reason, the inspiration that really enabled me to think about building Minsky. And the essential thing that Minsky adds to any other software package, which you've seen just in that demo a moment ago, is the Godley table. And I named the Godley table after Wynne Godley. And Wynne was also a major influence on me. So what happened there was I got back in the days when Australia had decent funding for universities. This is 2000. I got sabbatical leave of 6 months, and the idea is what is supposed to happen for an academic and a real research university is that you get 1 year off in 7, which is they call it sabbaticals. It's like the Sabbath, and that's where it originated from. So 1 year off to go and work on just what you want to do, no teaching, no administrative responsibilities. We got that every 6 months. So I got 6 months to spend at the Levy Institute, and that's where Hyman Minsky last worked before he moved to Italy. And I actually stayed in Hyman Minsky's room at the Levy Institute. And Wynne Godley was in the very next room. And Wynne has somebody who insisted upon the importance of what he called stock flow consistent modeling. And that's what really I was showing here. You've got to have the stocks and flows properly defined. You must be stock flow consistent. And Wynne worked, as most economists do, in what they call discrete time. So you have T and T minus 1 and T minus 2. And that is a mistake because, first of all, as I posted recently as one of my chapters in the new book I'm working on, time is not discrete, time is continuous. And secondly, the fact that it's discrete time is really hard to handle properly, so nobody does. And what you get is really, really bad errors out of it. So the idea of stock flow consistency and using tables to lay out the finances was what I got from Wynne, and hence I named the tables in Minsky Godley tables in his honor. Now, just to show the way that this works through, if you simply have assets and liabilities, and you've got buyers being one of your liability accounts and sellers the other, and just imagine it's like a single sale here, then if you have a sale of the widget, the money goes out of the buyer's account, so the bank's liability to the buyer falls, and then into the sellers, so the bank's liability to the seller rises, and that's the transaction that that Graziani was talking about previously, buyer and seller. But that is still seeing the bank as an intermediary. It doesn't actually have any impact upon the amount of money in circulation. So what you get the bank becoming absolutely essential is when it creates money. And then what you have here, I'm imagining here that you're going shopping with your credit card. Well, when you first of all swipe your card, what that does is, in an instantaneous way, creates debt, your debt, and the money you then transfer to the seller. So your debt goes up, the seller's bank account goes up, the assets of the bank have risen, the liabilities have risen equally, but that has created money. So this is why, and what I've done, and this is something which I haven't done on my own, obviously, with lots of interaction with colleagues, but I've managed to show why this matters macroeconomically, because the attitude of neoclassicals is, it's too complicated to model the fact that banks create money. Let's just pretend that they don't. And it doesn't have any macroeconomic impact. Well, bullshit. It has a huge impact. So if you look at how they model it, they imagine that banks are just intermediaries. Banks enable a borrower to meet a lender, and they then charge the service fee for the introduction. And fundamentally, in that sense, the loan is an asset of the saver and a liability of the borrower, and the bank isn't involved. And when they want to explain how they create money, they use the money multiplier model. But that model requires all loans to be in cash, and I'm happy to illustrate that later on. And when you look at these models, I was taught these models at university as an undergraduate, and they sound plausible. In fact, the hard thing is escaping from them as a reference point. And I've now completely escaped from them, and I have a complete explanation, not just for them, but for the alternative approach as well. But if you're learning it at university and you're not doing accounting, you don't get some of the double entry tables and so on, or at best you show what are called T tables, which are fairly obscure devices, they still sound plausible. You know, the bank gets money, lends it out, blah, blah, blah. When you model them in Minsky, they're obviously nonsense. So what I want to do is show you how to put these models together. And I said, don't panic. The model I did a while ago for JP, the hard part was getting the logic of which starting by T minus T plus 10, and then trying to combine that with whether you had money in your bank account or not. So you'd stop paying when you got to that point. That was the difficult bit. And that's because, as it happens, we're using an unusual thing for our logic switch called a Heaviside function. And it doesn't quite work the way I'd like a logic switch to work. So that caused a bit of angst. But apart from that, it's incredibly easy to build a model in Minsky. And the reason that I designed the Godley tables is that if you try to model money in any of the existing system dynamics programs like VenSim or Stella or I think Simulink, the works, it's so bloody hard to get the accounting right. Because what you've got to do is you must increase one account or decrease one account by as much as you decrease one account or increase one account. And you can get the sign wrong easily. What Minsky does is says you must make sure that every row sums to zero. And then if you do that, I'll give you a zero in the assets minus liabilities minus equity column. And that means that particular monetary transaction is modeled properly. And then the other thing Minsky does is it's very, very easy to change where tables are. So I think I'll do this. I've been so busy writing a piece on Richard Tolter that I haven't checked the lecture. So I might be losing my train occasionally as I go forward. But it's easy in Minsky to transfer and say, well, it's not the saver who owns the loan, it's the bank. Now it takes about 5 mouse clicks to convert from where the saver originates money and therefore owns the loan to where the bank owns the loan. Whereas if you try to do that on a system dynamics program, you've got to delete wires and reattach wires and move things around, and it's really, really complicated. And in fact, I was working with what's called the New Economic Foundation in London, not for them, but with them, back when I first started at Kingston in 2014. And they had a brilliant Italian, I think he's Italian, brilliant Italian modeler trying to build a model of the economy in this flowchart system called Stella. And a large part of it was their model of money creation. And I just said to him, look, you're not going to be able to do it. You'll make a mistake at some point. You'll realize you've got to redesign it. It'll be too hard. They never finished the model. And this happens time and time and time again because modeling the monetary system is really quite complicated unless you use the world's first graphical user interface, which is what double entry bookkeeping is. So that makes it much, much easier. So you can actually model in Minsky without writing a single equation because the structure of the model itself is enough to tell you what's going on. And when you're typing in, buy, the money coming out of the seller's account being minus buy and going into the into the buyer's account being minus buy and going into the seller's being plus buy, Minsky then says the rate of change of the seller's account is plus by, and the rate of change of the buyer's account is minus by. It's writing the equations for you in the background. You don't even have to look at them. So I really do encourage everybody who's in this course, if you're interested enough to be in this course and listen to me rave on a Thursday for you every week, you're interested enough to download this fucking software and try it yourself. Okay, please, because it's just get over the initial hesitancy about it. Now, by the way, I think that's now not the latest version of Ravel. I think we're up to 3.2.0. So if you want to check that, try 3.2.0. Courtesy of the meetings that I mentioned to you last week, we're doing a lot of fine tuning of Minsky right now, mainly to add sort of gee whiz type elements to it rather than fundamental changes to the underlying system, because we want to get the people in this company we're talking to go, gee whiz, we'd like to buy it off you. So, and even if they don't, the change that we're making will make the program more usable by people who will end up buying it off us if we start retailing it, which we'll do next year if we haven't sold the IP in the meantime. So Ravel can do everything that Minsky can do, and it also includes numerical analysis. As I've mentioned, I'm sorry, it won't run on a Mac. And I mentioned it updated several times. It's been updated twice this week. So keep an eye for the latest version. So you can download Minsky from SourceForge or GitHub. They've both got exactly the same code in them. And you either download the release version or the latest beta. And what's going on there, and it's now slightly more complicated again because we're now developing two production streams. So there's a release version, which if you go to the SourceForge webpage, a little green button, click on that, that'll download. And if you're talking Minsky, it'll work on Macs or PCs or Linux. Whatever you're operating on, it will bundle, give you the relevant bundle. It'll check in your operating system and then provide the install file relevant for your particular operating system. So Minsky is universal. It's an open source cross-platform software. Or you can download the beta. Now, the beta is where we're fixing up bugs or adding in the previous version. And that used to be we both fix up bugs in the betas and also add new features in the betas. And now what we're doing, because we're getting so close to, it's a production level program now, we have a beta and an alpha stream. And in the betas, we're fixing up bugs. And in the alphas, we're adding new features. And then what we periodically do, once the new features stabilize, we meld the alpha and the beta together. And the beta then has, that particular beta will have all the features that we've added with the alpha version. And then once we're confident enough with all that stuff, periodically we'll do a new release, and that becomes what you click on with the green button. So that's the whole thing. But I would really appreciate, because you are, again, dedicated, given the fact that you're, again, putting up with me Wednesdays and Thursdays, if you give us user feedback, whether that's because you're rank amateur or you found something that's a bug, it really helps us in finding the program. And like, for example, at the moment, one of the bugs that's getting in the way is that I don't know why, Russell doesn't know why, and it only happens under Windows. But if you click on a form or you try to stretch a box, it will then tell you the mouse coordinates. And it tells you the mouse coordinates in a form that lies behind the form you're working on. Yeah, it's really frustrating. But somebody will do it in such a way that they then say, oh, this is what I did. And Russ will go, I know the part of the code that does that. And he'll then go and fix it up. So it really does help. And this is actually was last week that was true. That's sort of been fixed. Sometimes you can't. We have a particular tab for putting godly tables on so you can lay out an overall economic structure. Sometimes you can move the godly tables around. Other times you can't. At the moment it's what we call a Heisenberg bug. And for those of you who know your physics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, they're the worst form of bugs. You don't know what the F generates them, but they're there. So we've got to search those down. Now there's two user groups. There's one, they're both at what's called Mailman at SourceForge. The beta testers, and that's for giving us feedback, and the users, and that's like a community where if you're using it, somebody will say, I've got this great new model, take a look, or they'll say, I tried to do this and it didn't work. Has anybody got an idea how to do it? So it's a conversational thing. So that's the background for Minsky. I'm going to give you lots of comments on Minsky and over the 13 lectures and 3 workshops in this series. And this is our second lecture. I'm going to go through lots of these over time. So this is the GUI. And that's likely to change a bit because, as it happens, we have some very important stuff under VAR here, which we're probably going to move to the main menu. And we're now going to add a couple of extra tabs. One is going to be a publication tab. So those things will change over time. These icons here are likely to remain constant, and they're groups of icons. So I'll just go through the components. There's a menu bar, and that's menu-driven access to all the features, usual sort of story. Control bar, and that is the left-hand button is to recalculate. The red button, do not press the red button, is record. It's not working all that well. We've sort of ignored it. We have to get it out of the way because as soon as he presses it there, yeah, I know. Is anybody here a fan of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Okay. You might remember in the second episode, when Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent have been taken aboard the Heart of Gold. There's a button that Dent presses at one point, and a sign comes saying, "Do not press this button again." So that's in that category. With that recalculate, record, or run a simulation, you saw me changing the speed and starting a simulation and so on. The zoom button is really useful. You can zoom out to see an entire model. And if somebody like Tyrone Keynes might have a model that takes up 4 big screens, or you zoom in and see a particular feature. That's very, very useful. The tabs, the main one you work on is the wiring tab. The equation tab will show you what the mathematics are of the model you're building. The parameter and variables tab, we might have actually reduced that just to being variables. Now I've got to check. Shows you what the definitions are right now of your model. Plots, you can put plots on individually, godly tables on their own, that sort of thing. And the widget bar is where you spend most of your time. That's where you bring in tools that are necessary for modeling different elements. The canvas, and this is something which I wish we could actually exploit the full power of it. I have a 4K monitor, and that is 4,000 by 2,000 pixels. The total real estate of our design canvas is 100,000 by 100,000, which is equivalent to 25 by 50 4K monitors. It's gigantic. And the reason for that was we have always wanted to use Minsky as a control panel for an economy or a corporation, and mainly looking, of course, at using it in national economies. So you'd be able to, the intention is to be able to have a set of screens as big as that, showing a model of an entire national economy with your ministers doing the inputs to try something in silicon before they impose it on the real model. That's the major intention there. So the godly table is the main thing for money. That's the bank icon there. That's the very first thing we designed. And if you click it and then you place it somewhere on the canvas, then you get that bank icon standing there. And to use it, you either double click on the icon or you right click and choose on the right click menu, open godly table. And a general rule in Minsky, if all else fails, use the right click mouse, the right mouse button, because we've dumped an enormous amount on the right mouse button, which is one reason why I will not use a Macintosh. It doesn't have one. So you've got to do some crazy keyboard emulation, and it can be done, but I really don't like it. So if you do it, what you get is this window popping up, and you notice I'll talk it through here. That's assets, liabilities, and equity. So you classify every account you're looking at as either an asset or a liability, and then the remnant, the difference between the two, is the equity for each entity you're looking at, and each godly table is relevant to a particular entity in the society. You then put the account names in the next row, and that can be loans, deposits, workers, capitalists, etc., etc. Initial conditions go here, and that's the initial amount of money in an account when you start a simulation. Now, frequently, I will impose a set of numbers on reserves and loans and bonds and stuff like that, and you can actually fit that up to historic data. You can take a look and say, okay, what is the level of reserves in the American economy? What's the level of loans? What's the level of bonds ownership by banks? And then guess what deposits go to different groups and so on and so forth. And then that's what you That's what you use the initial conditions for. Sometimes I'll start from 0 as well, just to show that the system could lift itself up by its own bootstraps. The plus keys, let's go back a bit there. There's plus, minus, and an arrow key to move things. And the plus keys up here create new columns. Minus key deletes the column you're on, and the arrow key moves the column around. And the same thing applies on the rows here. Once you've tapped an initial row, that then creates a row for transactions. And just to start with an incredibly simple system, if I'm going to look at fiat money, I'd have reserves, which are created by government money creation, and loans, which are created by bank money creation. And I can work with a single liability of deposits. And then, of course, I've got to look at the bank equity. This is one area which gets people confused, because we are stretching things a bit here. When you talk about the equity of a bank, you're talking about all the assets they own in excess of their liabilities. And those assets will include, they can't own, these days banks can't own shares in other companies, but the value of their own shares, or the value of their buildings, et cetera, et cetera. We're not talking about that. We can include that in the system, but when we have a single equity column here, what I'm talking about effectively, that's like the bank's own bank account. That's the account the bank can spend out of. Okay, so it's short-term equity, if you think of it that way. And then to model this, I've got to have 3 basic for the modeling credit creation: lending by the bank, interest payments, and repayment. And what you do is you've got to type each word twice on the row you're looking at, and it's case sensitive. So capital DATE is not the same as lowercase DATE. So if I do that here, and I'll dive through, because I'd like you to be playing along, but I know it's a bit hard in the lecture. That's why I'm going to give a workshop in the next lecture, or the next week, or the week after that. So we have new loans, and what you type is lend in loans, which create lend and deposits. Interest payments go from deposits to the bank's equity, and repayment reduces deposits and reduces loans. And I might add too, by the way, when I was first working in trying to model money, I didn't believe that bank repayment of loans destroyed money. My attitude was, why would banks destroy something they've created? You know? And once you do the double entry bookkeeping, yeah, it's true. If you repay a loan, what's actually going on is the bank says, okay, you're going to reduce our liability to you. We will therefore reduce our asset by the same amount. And since money is fundamentally the liabilities and equity of the banking sector, that's destroying money. So I was wrong, and designing Minsky taught me the right way to go about it. So you can have all sorts of combinations, or not all sorts, there's 3 sorts of combinations. You can have 2 positive entries. What I've got here, loans are going up, which are an asset, and liabilities go up, which are deposits go up, which is the liability. You can have 1 negative and 1 positive, which is what's going on there. And that's a transfer either between assets or between liabilities and equity. Okay, so liabilities can go down, equity goes up, or you can have a transfer of 1 asset goes down, another one goes up, or 2 negative. So those are your various options. And that's different. Is anybody here an accountant? No, everybody's shaking their head. Okay. Accounting uses credit and debit, and they've got very peculiar rules about how you classify something as a credit or a debit. And I can never get my head around it. And I just thought, now let's just work plus and minus. And that is actually much more straightforward. So Minsky can actually convert across from the plus and minus. We use the debit and credit. We've got the complete correspondence between plus and minus and debit and credit. I wish accountants would move across to plus and minus, but if they did, accounting wouldn't be such a specialized profession anymore. They might lose part of their income. So maybe that's one reason they don't do it. So that's it. And this is why J.K. Galbraith, when he said money creation is so simple that the mind is offended, he actually got it wrong. It's even simpler than he thought it was. Simply adding the same amount to a loan as you add to a deposit creates money. And what you got it then in the case is a bank is marking up both its assets and its liabilities. And that's the unique power of a bank, because to be able to do that, you've got to have control of both your assets and your liabilities. You have to be able to mark them both up. Now, if you are a non-bank, you can't increase your liabilities. Okay, you can if you pay, you can reduce an asset and increase a reduce one asset and increase another asset, but you can't increase your liabilities because you don't have any to the public. So the fact that you can take deposits is not done because banks need the money to lend it out again. It's because having deposits means they have got control of both assets and liabilities, and with that control, they can create money. Okay? Without it, you can't do it. So once you have this in your mind, it's very difficult to think about money in the old-fashioned sense that mainstream economic textbooks teach it. So lending increases both assets and liabilities. That creates money. Repayment marks them both down. That destroys money. And you can also have other obligations flowing from the act of money creation. And I should model this. I simply haven't had time. But this is a great article by John Carney from almost a decade ago, if not longer, called Basics of Banking. Loans create a lot more than deposits. And it's a very sensible little paper. It doesn't say you need reserves to create loans, but it says the opposite. If you create loans and you have a reserve requirement, you're going to have to get some more reserves. And you also have to raise more equity at some point. Now, you can include that in the dynamics, but I haven't got around to modeling it myself. That'd be an interesting exercise if anybody wants to have a go at it. But I'll just go through simple models now, then look at the neoclassical fantasies and why they're fantasies. So I did this as I've got to go back and change the lecture at some point because I was doing it as a combined workshop. But if you've done the operations that I'm talking about there, and you haven't changed a particular feature of Minsky, then you're going to be seeing the flows turning up on the left-hand side of the bank icon and the assets showing up down the bottom. So those are your stock variables. Those are your flow variables. And one can cause the other, but you do not mix them. That's, again, the importance of stock flow consistency. So to build a model, once you've got that, you've got to then use variables, your flow variables, and define them using your stock or flow variables. So stocks are already defined by the Godley table, and that, if you take a look at the, I'll come over here, probably better to look at it. If you look at this edge of the stocks, it's a flat line, but the output is a triangle. The flows have got a triangle on both sides. What that means is there's no inputs to here because you've already defined them in the Godley table. So once you don't need to define these because the table itself has defined them, but you have to define these. And you define these in terms of stocks or the flows themselves. And if you want to see what the equations are, you click on the equation tab. And what you're getting as you put those, that table I showed a moment ago, has generated these differential equations. And that's, again, the beauty of working in continuous time, because Minsky is doing all this for you automatically. If you do it in discrete time, you might say loans at t are equal to loans at t minus 1 plus lending at t minus 1. Or is it t? And you've got stocks and flows on exactly the same line. And that's where a lot of the errors that economists make in confusing stocks and flows comes from. But Minsky just keeps it completely separate. The loans are defined by the table itself. You've got the rate of change of stock on one side, the flows that are causing that rate of change on the other. And that guarantees that you've got stock flow consistency. I'm going to stop. I will throw a little question here. Why is that model incomplete? What have I left out? Any ideas? Give you a hint. It's something that was relevant for the model I did for JP. Come on, give it a try. Now, don't be embarrassed by making the wrong answer. I've seen academics do this. They don't want to make a mistake, so they don't say anything. Come on, give it a go. What's missing? Any ideas? Yes, JP.
In the real world, time is discrete when it comes to interest payments.
No, that is an interesting point, but individual entries are discrete. But when you look at the overall mass of entries, you're better off modeling it as a set of flows, like population growth, for example. Each baby is discrete, but the rate of change of population of China, you're better off to say that the rate of change of Chinese population is 0.2% or 1.1% of China's current population. It's not that. That's an important thing that I've had to work on again with some of my colleagues. I've got no spending coming out of the bank's account. Okay. So as this model runs, all the money would turn up in the bank's account, and there'd be no money left. And that again comes back to the point with JP's model. That's what he'd left out in the thinking there, the verbal, the intuitive model. So when you include that, you get a system. This is not yet a system because I've got an inflow into an account but no outflow. So what you've got to do is define the flows here, and you define those on the canvas. And there's 3 ways now pretty much to put them on there. You can right click on the Godly widget and choose copy as one of the drop down menus as copy stock variables, and then you place them on the canvas all as one group, or do the same with flows. And what you get is a canvas that looks like that. So lend, interest, and repay I've placed on the canvas, and then I've just which were the flows, and then I then did the stocks after that, which is why they're grayed out. Okay? Those are your flow variables, and they've got, as I said, triangles on both sides. Those are your stock variables. They've got a triangle on one side, but a block on the other because you've already defined them somewhere else. Okay? And the simplest thing to define is interest. So interest is the interest rate multiplied by loans. So you've got to bring interest rate inside there. You've got to define a parameter. And again, several ways to do that. The most conventional is there's what's called the VAR widget. So if you look up in the menu that I showed earlier, you click on VAR first of all. So you click on this one, and then this menu pops up, and then you choose parameter, and then you get a window coming up, create parameter, and you type the name in over here. I'll just move on. Try this. You type the name in here, give it an initial value. You can give it units. I don't talk enough about units, by the way. I'm happy to chat about that after I finish the lecture. And you can give maximum, minimums, and step sizes so you can vary things during a simulation. If I type interest underscore curly brackets rate close curly brackets, that then gives me the word interest subscript rate, which is one of the, ridiculous enough, Minsky is the only program in the industry that supports superscripts, subscripts, and Greek characters. All the others required to write everything in English, which I find gets very hard to read after a while. So I select, if I type 0.05 there, that's the 5% rate of interest, maximum of 20%, minimum of 2%, step size of 1. And then you've got an interest rate defined as a parameter with a current value of 5%, a maximum of 20, minimum of 2, and you can vary it in 1% steps. That's the whole idea of setting up that way. And parameters only have they're blue in color, and they only have an output because you defined them independently. If it's a variable, if you make interest rate into a variable, it will have an input as well. So a more sophisticated model would make the interest rate a variable depending upon the values of other elements in the system. You put them next to each other like that, and type a multiply key. Okay. And then you hover your mouse over interest rate, and you see a little circle appears. If you click in that circle, an arrow will come out, and you then bring the arrow close to, it doesn't have to be on the input port, and it will then snap into that point. And you did the same for loans and interest, and you've now said the interest payments are equal to the interest rate multiplied by loans. And then you can add a graph to a model by putting a graph icon again from the main menu, and then you attach deposits and bank to the inputs and run the simulation. And what you get, as I mentioned beforehand, is deposits will go to 0 because there's no outflow from the bank's account. So it's not again, this is the same old point. JP, I really thank you for that, by the way, because it does help to clarify something. And I hadn't modeled that idea of deferred interest before. So I've now got an extra way to talk to people who still see that same issue. But there's no feedback. So you've got to have an outflow as well to make it actually a system. And what I do is add one more row, and I say bank spending. I've got spend minus spend coming out of the bank's short-term equity account, plus spend going into deposits. So the banks buy things off the non-bank system. And yes, Charles.
I don't understand what's meant by bank spending.
Oh, wages, buying machinery, paying rent, all that sort of stuff.
Taxes on the property.
buying Lamborghinis. I mean, if you, in a sense, what we're doing is lumping all capital. When I do a model, what I normally do is I have bankers, workers, and capitalists. Or I'll have firms, workers, and banks. And then if you think about it, what I'm really saying, there's a social class of capitalists who own firms, there's a social class of workers who have to do wage labor, and there's a social class of bankers who make money out of interest. So in that fundamental sense, if you've got, JP Morgan going off and buying himself a Rolls Royce, then that's buying a Rolls Royce off Ford, and the transfer goes from the bank's equity, which is JP Morgan's bank account, to the Ford's account, which is part of the firm's accounts. So there's a tendency, and I'm always trying to get away from this myself, to think in terms of individuals when you're modeling a macroeconomy. So I prefer to work at the level of social classes. And then if I did, for example, want to generalize and say, well, firms are owned by shareholders, and then banks are owned by shareholders, I'd have two classes of shareholders. I have shareholders _ banks, shareholders subscript firms, and then income from them going differently, because what neoclassicals will do is mix the whole damn lot. So their model, what they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They have a single person, single agent, who owns the only firm in the economy, which operates under perfect competition, and hires the only worker, who is the person who owns the firm, and then pays wages and profits, and if they bring a bank in at all, interest to himself, which is ridiculous. See, they lump it all together. So Minsky lets you separate that, but fundamentally you're working at the level of social classes. Is that okay?
Yeah, so
any more?
Okay, just explain why the CEO of a Macquarie Bank in Australia gets paid $57 million. They've got to do something with the money that builds up.
Fundamentally, yeah. I mean, if you're getting paid that lump of money, you're spending not a lot of it. I mean, if I spend pretty much what's in my bank balance every month, unfortunately, at the moment. 57 million would take me a few more than 31 days to spend. What you then show is he spends out of that account much more slowly than a worker would spend. So I use what I call time constants, whether it's an engineering concept, but I'll attach a time constant to relate the amount of money in a bank account to how fast it's spent. So banks necessarily have a larger time constant because they spend more slowly. So if you imagine banks, and you're talking about, the CEO of Macquarie Bank and those sorts of incomes, they might take them, if they've got no other income coming in, and they spend at a constant rate, so this is the tangent to an exponential rate of spending, they might last 5 years. You might have a time constant of 5. But if you think a worker working at Kmart and how fast they've got to spend, given the very low income they've got, then they might take, they could take 2 weeks to 4 weeks and their account's empty. So their time constant is going to be 1/50, which is a week, maybe 1/12, which is a month. And therefore what you get, that is actually what Keynesians call the propensity to spend. So it turns up as a rate of spending out of a bank account. Is that okay?
Okay.
I'll show that later in the, okay. Herb.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the spending, and another way of thinking about it would be the expenses of operating the enterprise.
Absolutely. That's a major part of it too. Yeah.
Yeah. Heat, hydro, buying computers, having all the equipment they need, fixing the building up when you go into the bank. There's a lot of expenses in terms of overhead.
Exactly. And like, that's what when you take a look at the cost of actually creating money, it is something at the order of 2% of, of the stock of money. Because you've got to have the infrastructure, you've got to be paying people, you've got your back office, you've got your servers, your data people, programmers, security staff, front of desk. Can I help you with that? Would you like fries with your loan? All that sort of stuff, and that's an expense. So it tends to be of the order of 2 to 3% of the total amount of money you've got on deposit, and that. You've got to include that in your thinking, or you're not doing the complete thinking there. JP.
In your differential equations you had before, how was lend related to the other variables? Could you go back a screen?
Haven't done that yet, so I'll show that in a moment. And that's, again, fairly simple. I mean, I do it in a more complicated way. If I'm modeling Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, then what I have is most lending is being used for, actually in my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, all lending is to finance investment in real capital. So I have the rate of change of debt, which is lending, being equal to investment minus profits. Okay? At the other extreme, if you look at household borrowing, and this has been work that's been done by my good mate Matteo Scriselli, who's a mathematician in Canada, he did the other extreme, modeling only household lending, and so that household lending is related to house prices. So you have the rate of lending depending upon the rate of growth for house prices. So there's a range of different ways to do it, and the target would be, in terms of doing a model, to get something which is realistic given the circumstances you're looking at. So when I did my Minsky model, this is right back in 1982 when I was working in straight differential equations, long before I even thought of Minsky. I simply hypothesized that the essential role of borrowed money is to finance investment when investment exceeds, the desire to invest exceeds retained earnings. And that's what led to my model of Minsky's cycle, my tornado collapsing economy model. And then about, 8 years after I'd published that paper, of all people, I found two of the main stalwarts of what's called the efficient markets hypothesis, Fama and French, had done research into what was the main determinant of investment, and they found the overwhelmingly strong determinant of the level of investment was rate of change of long-term debt. So even reactionary neoclassicals, when they do empirical research, they found that was the main function of corporate debt. Now, of course, when you get to housing debt, a major factor people are borrowing for is because they want to speculate on house prices, and that I've also done the relationship for. So you choose your model for what you wish to simulate. Is that okay? I'll come and show the simple model in a moment anyway. So with spend, and I did this with the earlier model I showed, I based spending on the amount of money in the bank account. So you might say the bank has a spending rate of spending 10% of what's in its deposit account per year. That means you have 20, which I've got here, and let's say that's $20 billion. Then the annual spending by the bank will be $2 billion per year. So to create this, you can simply start typing on the canvas. You don't have to click on parameter and choose a parameter from the menu. You can simply start typing, and this pop window will pop up, and then you'll type bank underscore, which gives you a subscript, curly bracket spend, which gives you a subscript for the whole word spend, and then caret, which is on the 6 key for most keyboards. That's give you a superscript, curly brackets rate, and then what you'll get on the canvas is, first of all, this little window here, this one. That's for typing the text in. Then when you hit the OK button, this one comes up, and now you can define the elements of it. So it starts off assuming it's going to be a flow, but you then choose parameter from that window. And then once you've typed it all in, you place it on the canvas, and then there's this thing called the browser, and we're going to have to relocate that at some point. But the browser gives you access to all the terms you defined in a model. So at the moment with this one, I've got bank spend rate, which has just been defined, banks, and which is the equity, deposits and interest. That's a stock, that's a flow, another parameter, a flow, a stock, a flow, a stock, a flow. And you can then just click on them and place them on the canvas. And that means you've got permanent, easy access to defining your variables. And what I'm doing, I'm multiplying bank spend rate by banks to get a spend level. So I haven't clicked on the recalculate key yet, but that's the bank spend rate is 10%. Banks have got 20. So the answer when you click on the run key is going to be start off at 2 per year. And so you do that. If you run the model with the one I've shown you a moment ago in the lecture, you'll notice deposits and the amounts of money stabilize. Because ultimately the spend rate tapers to being the same as the interest earned. And that's a common outcome in a dynamic model. That's going to that's what you're going to call a dynamic equilibrium. Now, I've then got to define lend and repay. And this is the question you asked a moment ago. So the simplest I do is to relate it to the level of loans outstanding already. Of course, for that to be possible, there must already be loans. So I've got to set up an initial condition where loans occur. But there are many, many other ways to go about defining it. So if I define blend rate and a spend rate and give them the parameter values I've typed up there, then I can relate the money stock to GDP by saying, well, let's have a Milton Friedman model where GDP is generated by the turnover of money. The sum of deposit accounts plus bank short-term equity is money. Define a parameter, which is the velocity of money, and multiply the two together, and you've got GDP. And then what I normally do is I'll take the parameters, because parameters are also your control elements. As you change the parameter value of a parameter, you'll change the result of a model. And what I got when I do all that is this sort of thing. And I'm varying the interest rate and varying the lend rate using these controls at the top here. But interest rate there, of course, determines what comes down to interest rate over here. So this again, I find this quite weird. We're about the only program in system dynamics to enable you to change parameters during a simulation. Now, that wasn't my idea. I stole it from another program, which has since failed on the market, called VisSim, which is by far my favorite system dynamics program. It just lost out to MATLAB, unfortunately. But no, all the other programs, you've got to set the parameters up and then run it and see what the results are. You can't change things and see them dynamically. So what you can see out of that, which is fairly rough, they've got them in separate windows. Increasing lending increases GDP. If repayment exceeds lending, GDP falls. So what you've got is basically saying credit creation drives the economy. Money matters. But I haven't at any stage included reserves. And this is where, again, neoclassical economics has confused us completely by imagining that banks lend out reserves. But in fact, what reserves are for are government money creation. So if you look at how the neoclassicals talk, they say a depositor puts money in deposit accounts, the deposits go up. The bank puts that deposit money in reserves, so reserves go up. Then they lend out a bit of the reserves, and then you get this iterative process of creating money. But that's not what happens at all. Reserves are there for interbank settlements. And funnily enough, my father never talked to me about this stuff in any great detail. That's what he did for a living. My father was the Commonwealth Bank's representative on the settlements board of the Australian banking system. And every day at about 3 o'clock or 3:30, they'd physically go along to a room and settle out the accounts between the different banks. And this is pre-computer. And he then worked out how to computerize it. So my dad, even though it must be by osmosis that I ended up doing the same thing he did at a theoretical level rather than the practical stuff for a particular model. So what you find is if you model it if you don't break it down into one, Macquarie Bank and Westpac and Commonwealth Bank and so on, then what you have is reserves in the aggregate are the link between the private banks and the government. And if you take a look at taxation, then taxation is going to reduce your deposit account. You pay your taxes out of your deposit account. So I type minus tax in there first of all here, but I haven't yet typed in the other plus. So at the moment, assets minus liabilities minus equity is not complete. So what I've got to now do is say, well, where does tax go? What does it affect? And what I've got to add in that particular case is minus tax and reserves as well. So taxation destroys money and destroys reserves. Okay. In terms of what's circulating in individual economy. When you go in the opposite direction with spending creates government spending creates, I'm just renaming spending here, so I've got spend bank there, but government spending creates deposits and creates reserves. And this was the major thing that I learned from Stephanie Kelton, that the actual deficit itself creates money. Joe.
Steve, 100 years ago when the banks had their own bank bills, would they have
Yeah.
had to settle those as well?
That meant you had to have varying exchange rates between them. So they wouldn't exchange at par. So some banks would have higher status than other banks. And if you had a debt in one, if you had to pay debt to Wildcat Bank in Arizona, and you had money from Morgan's, then you might get a 3-to-1 ratio of your Morgan's bills to your Wildcat bills.
Wow. And is there a parallel in the sense that each bank's credit money has to be returned to its own banks the way the bills were?
And that's how they did work. That actually settled the actual money. Like Austrians have this wet dream. Sorry to any Austrian economists in the room, this wet dream about having a private money system where each bank issues their own money, and ultimately only the banks that are responsible would have deposits. And I think that's a load of bollocks, because people would put money in the Ponzi scheme first off and foremost. So, but yeah, there were actually 3 countries that had a large form, actually maybe 4, had a large form of private money and private money creation with private notes: America, Australia, New Zealand, and Switzerland. And it's quite a fascinating read to look up on those countries and see the history of most of those banks. And in America, they call them wildcat banks. The reason being, you could easily get a loan from the banks when you want to return the money to them. You easily pay interest, but to get rid of the loan, you had to go where the wildcats are. That's where they put the bank that took the loan back. So you couldn't get rid of the debt. Nelson, Joe, is that enough?
Well, I'm just trying to understand. So does that mean that the current system where each bank produces its own credit money on account is sort of parallel in that money is basically each individual's bank money, and that's why you have to settle up? No,
it's just that in this case, the money, and this is why one thing MMT will say is that banks are agents of the government. Now, I think that's a bit like saying, the banks do what the government tells them. Well, bullshit. It's the other way around. The tail wags the dog in that particular case. So they are agents for collection tax and for government spending to go through. That's quite correct. But politically, I think the banks dominate the government these days. So, the tail tells the body what to do, which is one of the great tragedies of our modern system. But fundamentally, the money that they're creating credit money, which has got a 1-for-1 equivalence with fiat money. So if you go to a bank and say, I want $1,000 in cash, they've got to give you $1,000 in banknotes, and those banknotes are government money. So in that sense, there's an agency relationship, but the power comes from the agent back, not the master of the government.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Nelson.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So, how does what about when banks, like private banks, loan to each other, and how does the LIBOR stuff fits into this picture?
Then for LIBOR, you've got to get to international banking, and then you've got different exchange rates and different currencies and so on. With individual banks, they will borrow and lend off each other. So, for example, if you have a deposit at Bank of America, and you transfer that, you pay money to Citibank, then the reserves of Bank of America equivalent to that payment have to be given to Citibank. And because at the same time, people who have accounts at Citibank will be buying stuff for people who have accounts at the Bank of America. So there's a net cancellation process there. And the actual volume of money transacted between the different banks is much, much less than the total volume of transactions. But what will also happen frequently, if as a result of those sorts of transfers, one bank ends up with more reserves than it wants, it will lend those reserves back at the overnight rate to the borrowing to the bank from which the money has come. So that's a huge internal market in the banking sector. But LIBOR and international stuff, then you've got a much more complicated system. And funnily enough, this is something I didn't know until recently, all American monetary transactions, wherever they occur, are settled through the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So if you have somebody in Kazakhstan buying something off somebody in Belarus with American dollars, that transaction goes through the New York Fed. Crazy. It should be going through an international monetary fund, which was the original idea of the bank call. Is that okay, Herb? Jill Nelson?
Yeah. So can
okay.
this be modeled as well in Minsky?
Sorry? Oh, yeah, you can, but then you've got, that gets much more complicated, and I haven't tried doing that yet because at the moment, when you put a godly table up, it'll have a particular currency as the type of the currency. If you don't specify, then it's just a generic currency. But you can say one is American, one is British pound, et cetera, But then what you've got to have transfers between them. You need to define an exchange rate. And we haven't really made that sophisticated yet. So what I would like to have, this again is the sort of thing I need development funds for. I've got to pay Russell or pay somebody else to put this code in there. I would like to have a settlement system built in. And as a settlement system, if you're exchanging pounds for dollars, then there would be an exchange rate, which would partly be market determined. And then that would mean that a transfer, like if I'm, using Hungarian forint to buy a new computer of somebody in England, I've got to have a conversion of forints into pounds. And then that's going to go through out of my Hungarian bank account into somebody's British pounds bank account with an exchange rate going through the central banks, et cetera, that I want to be able to model that, but at the moment to do it by hand is really hard work. So a large part of the idea of building Minsky is to make a lot of the stuff which takes a lot of manual coding an automatic thing, and we haven't yet got there. Herb.
I was just going to ask or clarify, because I heard this through one of the MMT sites, that bonds reserves are like the collateral for the loan. So they're issued by the finance department or the treasury, and they serve the same function as a loan document would if I borrowed money from a bank. It's collateral.
With bonds, you mean? What treasury bonds bought by a bank? Yeah, they'll use it at different times. I'm not quite. I can't quite follow the argument there, but they will be used as collateral at various times. The beauty of bonds is that if you have reserves, you can't trade them, and you can't speculate on them. But if you have bonds, you can trade and you can speculate. So a major reason why the banking sector wants to have bonds rather than reserves is A, they get interest off bonds, and B, they can speculate on the value of bonds. And that's the biggest financial market in the world.
And when taxes are paid, the central bank can reduce the reserves or the bonds, depending on what the mechanisms are that they're using. Yeah,
absolutely. This is the magic of a central bank. It's got an unlimited capacity to say, we want to buy that bond off you. Here's $1 billion. Give us $1 billion worth of bonds. And they can even say, terribly sorry that those bonds crashed in value we'll pay you face value. So that a lot of the rescues come through the fact that they have an unlimited capacity to do that, and they can mark up something at a higher value than you can actually get for it on the market. So that's the power of a central bank. Not a power that's well used, but that's the visibility they have. So what I've got here now, I'm expanding the model further, and I'm bringing in taxing and spending down here. And the simple way to do it, bring over here. What I've also changed, which is it's a right-click menu. This is only about a year and a half ago now we started doing, maybe 2 years ago. Rather than just having the bank icon and having to open up the godly table to see the tables, you can now have the table on screen. To some extent, you can edit inside there, but it's a bit limited. There are limitations there. So you can now show it on the canvas anyway. And what I've now got, I've got spending and tax being based on GDP. Of course, in a proper sophisticated model, the amount of spending depends upon the rate of unemployment. The amount of taxation depends upon the rate of profit. You make them variables. But to make a simple illustration, here what I've got is having a spend rate and a tax rate, as if the government can easily fine-tune the two. And I give them values of 0.3. So the spending of GDP government spending is 30% of GDP, and taxation the same. and I now vary the tax rate and the spend rate, and you've got the same effect as when you lend money or repay loans, that net government spending expands the economy and net taxation shrinks it. And this is the detail that escapes neoclassicals, because they don't have a concept of bank money creation. So they think everything is done by the government, and the government creates money or the government destroys money. They get that wrong as well. So, you know, it so much annoys me. These bastards get Nobel Prizes for stuff which is wrong according to accounting, but that's the world in which we live. So looking at reserves, and this is something, again, which I didn't realize until I read Stephanie's book, The Deficit Myth, and then looked at the logic. Government net spending doesn't just create deposits, it also creates reserves. This is the same in effect as with bank lending. Bank lending doesn't just create deposits, which are a liability, it also creates loans, which are an asset. So government spending creates deposits, which are a liability for the banking sector, and reserves, which are an asset. But unlike cash that we've got, you can't just go and spend the reserves on anything. So in the olden days, before the Great Depression, banks could use those funds to buy shares. Of course, that's a major reason why the Great Depression was great. And now one of the main acts of after the Great Depression, including the American, I've forgotten the name of the act right now, but the American act that stopped banks, that separated banks into retail banks and commercial banks. Retail banks can offer to, yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Glass-Steagall, as I call it. You probably got a better pronunciation than me, Charles. The reserves are not, you can't use reserves for anything. You can only basically use reserves to transfer between banks, or you can buy bonds with them. And that's the next element that I add. And banks did not get interest on reserves historically. Only after the global financial crisis did they start getting interest on reserves. Hope, have you got your hand up for a reason, or good. I was assuming not. I just want to make sure. Okay. So what I've added to actually show where reserves come from, you've got to add the central bank and the treasury. And also, it's worth showing the private sector's accounts as well, because when I initially modeled Minsky, we could just handle one godly table, and I then put everything into the banking sector. Then as we extended the capabilities, we had 2 and 3 and 4, and therefore whatever became an asset for one had to be a liability for somebody else in the system. So what I get to with this model, so I've got banks, the central bank, the treasury, and what I call the public. This is one of the ironies of the English language. Australia and the UK, by the public, they mean the private sector. I believe that confuses Americans, and I'm not amazed. So I'm tending to call it the private sector these days rather than public. But that's the basic idea. And so what you get is this interlocking set of tables coming out of it, because if you open up the central bank's godly table, you'll see there's in every godly table there's a downward pointing wedge, upside down black triangle, this thing here. And if you click on, you've got the central bank here, and you click on liabilities, I still haven't shown, in this particular model, I haven't shown loans yet as a liability of the private non-bank sector. So when you click on the down arrow, you can either say this is the liability is loans or it's reserves. Now we're talking the central bank, so the liability is reserves. So I click on that, and now all the operations that have been shown for reserves elsewhere now turn up in this column. So if you have 1,000 operations, if you had a very complicated model like one of Ty Keynes's models, when he then clicks on that, all the operations are coming across and shown here. And what you've then got to do is balance this side of things, because the assets minus liabilities minus equity is not zero. You've only got a positive spend and a negative for tax. So you've got a missing negative and a missing positive. The rows are unbalanced. So you need to add another row to let this be balanced. And of course, as well as having a liability to the private banks, the central bank has a liability to the treasury. And that's called things like the Treasury's General Account, TGA, or Consolidated Revenue Fund, CRF, et cetera, et cetera. So I just call this treasury here, just type an amount for it, and spending, the increase in reserves comes out of a fall in treasury. Okay. And the taxation of reserves increases what's in the Treasury fund. So you're getting a slightly more complete model now. I've still got to notice that I've got negative equity there turning up for the set, although I haven't balanced the row yet. At the moment, there's minus 90 there. So I put up with that and now bring in, I've got these three elements, and I bring in the Treasury, and I've now got the Treasury having an equity of 60. And how do you balance this row? The only way to balance it is government spending reduces the equity of the Treasury. And this is identical to what MMT argues, but put in a different way. So what I'm saying is the government creates money by going to negative financial equity. And that's different to how private banks create it. Private banks create money by boosting their assets and liabilities simultaneously. And since their liabilities include deposits, that's how they create money. In this case, with the government sector, the government goes into negative equity for itself, and that creates positive equity for the public sector, for the non-bank public. So minus spend turns up plus spend here, plus tax turns up as minus tax there. And that's the essential side, that this is the way fiat money is created. And once you've finally got everything shown twice, there I've got for reserves turning up twice, I've got loans turning up twice, deposits twice, and Treasury twice. So to get a complete model, you must show every account twice, and then you also have the transactions, and the transactions have to occur at least 4 times and possibly 8. Because if I show lending, that turns up 4 times, twice from the bank's point of view as an asset and liability, twice from the public as an asset and liability, but tax and spending turn up 8 times. So it isn't just double entry bookkeeping, it's octuple entry. And you get this given with this is what this is known in mathematics as the conservation law. The sum of all financial equity is 0. Now that is a strong constraint on what's allowed to be modeled, but that gives you realism in the financial sector. JP.
Yeah, so one thing that pops out is that it seems that in the Treasury, something is created out of thin air, or not.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's what fiat currency does. Yeah.
Okay, I had another sort of tangential question. It's not the right time. The interest is nominally controlled by the government, right? The interest rate?
In terms of setting interest rate, yeah.
So I never quite understood this. Like, when the government sets the interest rate, they set interest rate on basically like a overnight lending or treasury bonds or something. Overnight lending.
It's called in America. It's set by what they call the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets the overnight rate for lending between banks. So it's called the interbank rate. Pardon me, I've got a bit of a tickle on my throat. So the Treasury will the Federal Reserve will set the overnight rate for lending, the rate they will charge if a bank wants to borrow reserves off them, and then that will be the rate which becomes the reference rate for the banking sector. So let's say they've set the Treasury set, the central bank sets a reference rate of 5%, let's say, which is pretty much what it is right now. Then if one bank wants to borrow reserves off another bank, the bank that's borrowing will charge at 5% or 5.25. Whereas if they borrow off the Federal Reserve, which they've got a complete right to do if they're in the banking sector, then they'll pay 5%. And then what you get is what they call a window, a range that the Federal Reserve tries to keep the rate at that level. And it isn't necessary at all, frankly, for the loan rate to be with reference to that. But what banks do is normally set their rate as a markup on the prime rate. So if the rate is 5%, then banks will set their lending rate at, say, 8, and their deposit rate at, say, 3, and make their margin that way.
Yeah, it's
okay.
And the Fed's not the government, though, right? Technically,
right?
To throw another wrinkle in there, right? It's the private Fed.
Pardon me, Joe. Say that again.
The Federal Reserve is technically not the government; it's private, right?
No, no, it's one of these weird quasi public bodies that is very common in
Yeah,
America.
I know.
Yeah, so it's actually publicly owned, and the money, any profits the reserve makes on foreign currency trading and stuff like that must be remitted to the Treasury. But they operate as quasi private enterprises in each of the 13 districts. So it's quite a strange. America does this all the bloody time.
Well,
Yeah.
no, it goes beyond that. They have owners, and nobody knows who they are. It's a.
I don't think that's true. I believe that's
Mostly
been
held-
said. If you,
Huh?
if you do a bit of research, Joe, check the Federal Reserve website. They do explain that situation. When
Oh,
I read
okay.
it, I remember, okay, it isn't actually true. It's there's some sort of
That's Herb.
quasi-private
Herb's on.
elements, but they're not
Herb's
actually
on.
owned by anybody. Okay, yeah, that is a common basis. So what I'm doing here is showing this is the because the sum of all equity is zero, then positive equity for one group means negative equity for another. So if you think about the banking sector, banks must have positive equity. That's a rule of being a bank. If your assets don't exceed your liabilities, you're bankrupt as a bank, you must shut down. Okay. So if there's only private banking, which is an oxymoron, but I'll start with that anyway. There's only private banking. The non-bank sectors, which is the rest of the economy, would have to be in negative equity. Now, the non-bank sector is all the private, you and me, households, companies, et cetera, et cetera. So without government money creation, the non-bank sector has to be negative equity. And I think that's a lot of what causes the craziness and people's willing to borrow money and speculate on the value of non-financial assets like shares and houses. But if you look and say the government here have got non-government being plus 30, that's only because the government is minus 30. And then if you look at the non-bank, that's minus 20, and the banks are plus 20. So all these rules apply all the way through. By the way, all of this stuff I've learned by building Minsky. Okay, I didn't know it before I built Minsky. So it's the discipline of putting it together in double entry bookkeeping that's taught me what I know about this. And that's why I really would love you guys to have a go at doing this stuff yourself and see how you work out the dynamics of the monetary system. And then if you have a change in that equity, it's got to be equal to the change in the equity in the opposite direction to maintain that zero. So spend minus tax for the non-bank private sector, which creates equity for them, must have a spend minus tax or tax minus spend for the government, which creates negative financial equity for it. And I know this is a weird one, but that's how fiat money is created. And again, that's again one of these elements that people don't seem to be happy about when they try to think about it. I'm actually getting a bit, my voice is starting to crack here, and we're about the 1.5 hours mark. Do you mind if I stop at this point and just go through this particular slide and then we continue again next week? Are you getting a bit tired? I am too, I must say. So what we've got, just to recap this finals, this may indeed be the final slide, I haven't checked for a while, but banks create money by lending out more than they get back in repayments. Government creates fiat money by spending more than it gets back in taxation. And we live in a mixed credit fiat world, which is just accepted. This is how it's done. But people think, oh, that's wrong. The government shouldn't be in negative equity. Well, so you think you should be in negative equity, do you? Because it's like saying the seesaw, the government should be down. Oh, you mean you should be up? No, I want to be down too. Oh, you want to break the seaboard? You want to break this? It's a seesaw. Okay. Nobody goes on a seesaw to sit there. You want the dynamics to go on. This is just the nature of a mixed credit fiat system. They're both money creators. Banks expand their assets and liabilities to do it. Governments create negative equity, which is offset by positive equity for the other side. And the point, which I think is one of the powerful things about this, which undermines a sort of Austrian fantasy of we'd be better off just with private banks and no government money. If that's the case, the non-bank sector must be in negative equity. Nobody likes being in negative equity as an individual because you can't create your own money to cover it, whereas the big government can do it. So it's a good argument for government money and fiat money creation to enable the entire non-government sector to be in positive equity. And that's what we should allow. Okay, take a break. Let's have a chat. So we've got Joe leading us. So I've got to shut down this window here, pardon me. No.
That's a vital point, Steve. Good point. I just want to get back to reserves again. I put
Yeah.
in the chat a paper by Michael Kumhoff, a BIS paper, and he proposed his most recent proposal is to kind of do a compromise and have about 30% of the money central bank CBDC money. And in his modeling, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the paper, but in his modeling, there's less debt, which goes along with what you just said, for the public. There is the banks actually do a little better. The economy does better. But basically he's addressing, in my mind, as you know, he was a big fan of Fisher on the Chicago plane.
Yeah.
He's addressing this anomaly we have right now, where we have these gargantuan reserves out there, which we're paying interest on, which is really just an increase of the financialization of the system. So I just wondered if you've had a chance to look at that and whether you had any thoughts.
I'm in favor of central bank digital currencies. So, like, Michael and I are good friends, but he's a bit weird. He's a COVID conspiracy theorist, and he will not go anywhere where people wear masks.
Wow.
Okay, so we haven't, ever since COVID, I haven't seen him or spoken to him, which is a real pain because he's a good bloke, and he's actually the only neoclassical who understands money. And I'd like to see him socially, but he won't because I wear a mask. So, COVID's caused all sorts of crazy divisions, unfortunately. And he's also very, very neoclassical. So I like the starting point of his papers, but I never like the argument because it's all neoclassical.
Well, one of his positions is to demolish the loanable funds theory. Isn't that that's a Keynesian approach, isn't it?
It is, but he's somebody who he actually worked as a banker, I think, in Austria, and he said he knows he created money. He literally knows that he was working as a banker before he became an academic. He knew he was creating money when he made a loan, which is why he couldn't swallow loanable funds when he did his PhD. But he did a straight neoclassical PhD, and as a top-class modeler in dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. But all this stuff about forward-looking expectations and rational this and rational that, he's accepted that side of things. And I think it's all garbage. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the problem. And I know it's garbage. But he just learned that way. And I've seen his building a model, and he will have reams of A4 paper where he's writing down all the logic of going from a model of perfect competition. So in that situation, you have price equals marginal cost, and then you'd be buying off another sector where they've got monopolistic competition, and so that's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then you have all these Euler equations for people's consumption, and you and I, when we go shopping, we're estimating the future income stream for our entire dynasty forward to the year infinity, and that's what determines what we go, whether you buy toilet paper or Mars bars when you go shopping. Oh, give me a break. So I'm very happy to discuss the initial ideas with him because he's great at understanding the creation of money, but everything else is just off with the fairies. Charles.
Yes, Steve, it seems to me that you've thoroughly debunked neoclassical economics, and I don't need any more persuasion in that regard. What I'd like to see our emphasis now on is monetary policy that you can model, and that does work, but expressed in common sense, common language terms, a monetary policy, and perhaps even bordering into fiscal policy. Is that on the program?
Oh yeah, I mean, in fact, it comes down to fiscal policy primarily, because monetary policy, it's the opposite of what the neoclassicals argue. Monetary policy is fairly ineffective because all it sets is the interest rate. Fiscal policy is what sets the rate of growth of the money supply and has much more impact. And that comes out of the accounting again. But one thing I'll do, and I think I've got it for this next part of the lecture or a workshop. I think I'm a bit lost track because I'm doing so much. I'm starting to lose track of what I'm up to. I have 2 different courses and writing a book and taking on the neoclassicals over bloody climate change. My head's a bit spinning at the moment. But one thing I model is what happened during the 1920s and 1930s. Because if you look at what the American government did under Calvin Coolidge, they ran a 1% of GDP surplus every year. And they thought that was great. And Coolidge said that's what caused the boom of the 1920s. No, it didn't. What caused the boom of the 1920s was the private sector borrowing 5% of GDP on average every year from the private banks to speculate on stock markets and housing. So what you got was a boom caused by the private sector, when at the same time the government was reducing the amount of money. And I think there's a strong argument that that reduction of money by the government is partly what encouraged people to speculate on shares. So you had a huge party going on because of the money borrowing by the private sector. But then what you had with Ponzi schemes, caught up in all that, a huge amount of money was just share price speculation. And then people started to lose money on the shares. They couldn't meet their margin calls. The whole system crashed in one day. And so that logic, I can model that in Minsky. And I can show what happens if the government runs a 1% of GDP surplus and the private sector does nothing. Well, you get a collapsing GDP. What happens if it runs a 1% of service deficit and the private sector does nothing? You get a growing economy. So I can actually, because Minsky can handle both credit money creation and private and government money creation, you can run a virtual experiment and say, what if we did the 1920s all over again, but the government didn't run a surplus? And you get a very different outcome. So I will actually go through that, and it is ridiculously easy to model in Minsky. So I'm not sure whether I've got the workshop set up. I'll take a look at that, and I'll put a note on school after I've made sure of it. I think I've got it for next week, but I would like you to have a crack at it yourself. And I mean, there's a bit of a fear thing about using a new tool like Minsky. If you make a mistake, the computer won't blow up on you. Your wife might, because you spend too long on the computer. But you know, you can give it a try. Give it a try. Okay. And then I can go through that for the workshop.
What you just said is what I'm getting at. Modeling what happened in the 30s is modeling that system. What I'm anxious to see is the articulation of a monetary policy, and that, you know, by your modeling will work, and we won't have booms and busts like we have continually under the neoclassical system. So
I think you might mean fiscal as opposed to monetary, or a combination of fiscal and monetary.
Yeah. I mean, it fundamentally, when we say monetary policy, we often think of interest rate, because that's what neoclassical has done for the last 40 years. But the reality of what people mean by monetary policy is how fast you let the level of money grow. What should the government run a deficit or a surplus? That's what actually creates money. And the answer I get is, and this, of course, is caught up in the whole issue of climate change and whether you actually want a growing economy anymore. But what you want as a basic rule is that the rate of growth of the money supply should be equal to the rate of growth of the economy you want divided by the velocity of money. That's the basic rule. So if the velocity of money is 2, and you want the rate of growth of the nominal economy to be 6% per annum, then you want a 3%. Sorry, 3% per annum. You want a deficit of 6% of GDP. Okay? So that's the rule. It's the opposite. It's when you look at Milton Friedman's logic. Milton Friedman assumes a static economy, equilibrium. It's bullshit. We're always in a changing economy. If you want that economy to grow, then you have the rate of growth of money divided by the velocity of money, giving you the rate you need the money supply to grow at. And I'll explain that in more detail.
You and I know exactly what you're saying when you say that, but the man on the street has got no idea what you're talking about. And what I'd like to see is articulation of a monetary policy in man in the street language.
Yeah,
Is that
well,
possible?
it's quite possible. I mean, the trouble is at the moment I'm spending my time fighting neoclassicals on climate change because that's a far greater danger. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental thing is you have to legitimize a deficit and say that if you're going to have a growing economy, then you want a deficit which creates fiat money at a rate that sustains the rate of growth of the real economy. And you also want the government to be running a deficit so that it's in negative equity, which means other people are in positive equity, and therefore people don't feel inclined to go and borrow money off a bank and gamble on share prices and house prices. But if you think about all the bubbles, particularly Australia is a classic example, of course, the bubble has occurred where the government's been obsessed with running a surplus. What that surplus actually does is destroy money and reduce the equity of the private sector. So the private sector has an incentive to go to private banks to borrow money and gamble on non-financial assets like houses and shares. So I think a lot of the insanity of the Australian political system in particular, and the Americans during their subprime bubble, was because the government, without knowing it was doing it, was destroying money and therefore destroying the equity of the private sector, and that encouraged the private sector to gamble. That help?
It helps. Yep.
Good.
Thanks.
We're going to let. Yeah. I mean, one thing I'd like people to do. I mean, again, my time is. I'm working about an 80-hour week right now, and you know, I'm starting to crack, let alone my wife's opinion of what I'm doing all day. So I just can't add more tasks onto myself, but I'd be happy to have people write stuff and me then say what I think of those ideas and maybe how to model them and improve them using some wisdom from Minsky.
Yeah, well, I have done that with, I posted the draft constitution so that the whole thing's in context, but the economy section of that draft constitution outlines a monetary policy that I would love verification on, because at the moment I'm just a rank amateur on it.
Well, the basic logic to work from is simply the rate of growth. If you have a rate of growth of the nominal GDP, then you can say that's related to the amount of money in the economy. Your basic equation is GDP equals money times the velocity of money. So you're going to have the rate of change of GDP. It's going to be the rate of change of the two others combined. And then you can derive an equation for that and say what should be the rate of growth of the money supply given constant velocity. And the velocity of money used to be 2. So if you imagine the velocity of money is 2 and money is growing at 3% per annum, that will give you a 6% rate of growth of nominal GDP, which can be, say, 3% real growth and 3% inflation, which is not a bad target because the rate of inflation actually partially encourages people to spend. This is part of the idea behind the gazillion currency, that if you hang on to the currency, it depreciates in value, which is partly an encouragement to spend and have turnover of money. So that's your basic relationship.
Would it be as simple as the government running a bigger deficit when there was a recession? I mean, is it that simple?
Yeah, a deficit most of the time to create fiat money, because if you're not creating fiat money, you're telling people grow the economy while I shrink the money supply, which is silly. But if you say grow the economy more rapidly, because at the moment the private sector is dragging its heels, so because the private sector has gone into a slump, I'm going to spend more government money and create more fiat money and buy more things from the public sector, from the private sector by the government to encourage economic activity. That's when you have a larger deficit. So again, if you think about what the neoclassicals have done, their point of reference is a zero growth economy, which is madness because they're the ones who are encouraging, you know, no limits to growth. But their point of reference is zero growth. That's not the real world. The real world has always been about, you know, a 2 or 3% rate of economic growth. So if you want a 2 or 3% rate of economic growth, you want about you know, of the order of a 3% rate of growth in the money supply.
So are there examples of countries that run a, you know, steady deficit for, say, 10 years and experience growth, and other countries that run a surplus? And I mean, we know you just gave us a couple examples of
Japan
running a surplus and running into recession, but what about the flip side?
Take a look at the 1920s, 1940s, 50s and 60s. That was called the golden age of capitalism. And what you find back then, the government was normally running a deficit. Government debt was falling in America's case because the private sector was borrowing so much more money. You know, there's the private sector bubble going on all the way through. But you'll find, like Australia, for quite some substantial, to about 1965, Australia had pretty flat level of private debt, pretty constant government deficit under Robert Menzies, I might add, under a Conservative Prime Minister. He was quite happy to run deficits. And he saw those deficits of funding investment, government infrastructure, the Snowy Mountains scheme, universities. And that was, and the unemployment rate, you were likely to get kicked out of office if the unemployment rate got as high as 2%.
What would be the form of the government spending? You know, QE is not really government spending, right? Of course, there's give money to people in their pockets, helicopter money, but would there be other forms of government spending that would?
Oh, look, universities, hospitals, anything which is long term. I mean, one thing I've really pisses me off is see the way they've destroyed the university sector over time. And you want to have people be given time to be original thinkers and doing original research. You want students not to have to worry about the debt they've accumulated as soon as they leave a university. You want to be able to possibly fail students because they haven't fucking bought their degree, but they think they've bought it these days.
Infrastructure or long-term spending on public works.
And that's what gives you if I remember, like I'm 70 now, I talk like an old bloke. I still feel like a young man, but I can talk like an old one. It was better in the past because the level of government spending meant at university you weren't worried about the fees you had to pay, the debt you're accumulating. Infrastructure was well maintained. You had infrastructural projects, and that's what government spending is best for. You do not want the government deciding what you're going to eat in the cafeteria. Okay, that's where you get shit house food. I remember those days at Sydney University.
There's an interesting parallel there where, you know, people argue that the government's inefficient, it's going to do a bad job, it ought to be profitable on its, or we'll take the thing and privatize the post office. But it's kind of inverse logic, because actually if the government doesn't make a profit, it's actually better for the economy. There's no need for the government to make a profit.
I've got to get to Charles in a second here, but the basic point I think was very made by Avner Offer, who's a friend of mine, and done the excellent work on the where the Nobel Prize came from. And he's also just recently written a book which he gave me when I last saw him in England about 4 months ago, trying to say what's the divide between public and private spending. And he took this off an idea that I gave him through John Blatt, but he ran with it to say that the basic dividing line should be the public sector could invest in things where the payback period is longer than the private sector will tolerate.
Yeah, I remember that.
And that means education, infrastructure, hospitals, road, that sort of thing. That's where the government should spend. Charles.
Yes. I had a question that goes back to that point you were making about the bond market being the biggest financial market. I knew that was true. And I know that, they talk about how when bond prices go up, that means the interest rates are going down. They run inverse to one another. But I was trying to think about what's the argument for how does that benefit society when you allow that much wealth to be transferred and nothing gets made?
I don't like bond markets. Okay, I agree with you. I mean, it's quite logically possible for the Treasury to run a deficit and then finance it by selling bonds to the central bank. The one argument in favor of providing some sort of interest income to the banks is the payment system as a public service. Since you have the private banks providing it, a certain rate of return for doing that is valid. But what you've actually generated out of it by letting them sell the bonds and trade them, that actually destroys government money. If the private banks sell bonds to non-bank financial institutions, that destroys money. So you're letting them destroy money, and you've also got the speculation and gambling that goes on. And it's crazy. It's a market that needs to be tamed.
Yeah, I mean that. So I think the other Charles on the I really appreciate what he's trying to do in Australia, and that is look at the monetary system and come up with a system that is fair and basically encourages ordinary people to survive or to thrive actually. And it seems to me that's one area that you might look at is restricting the ability of these markets. It's restricting the ability of vast wealth to change hands without anything being produced. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's
kind
for
of a
example,
concept.
Charles and I are old enough to remember this, and that is that way back in the 60s, the private banks had a rule imposed by the central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia. They had to hold, I think, either 28 or 38% of their money in government and local government securities. So they were simply required to hang on to those. They couldn't sell them to non-bank financial institutions. All the deregulation to allow that sort of shit was run under the neoclassicals when they started dominating government policy in the 70s and 80s and abolished all those terrible restrictions. Those restrictions made sense. And it did two things. It meant there was less speculation, and there was also, to some extent, private funding of local government activity, because local governments can't create money, so they do have to sell bonds to raise money if they don't have enough revenue in terms of, you know, tax revenue they're levying locally. So yeah, there definitely should be controls in the financial sector.
Right. So, but have you ever asked anybody, like, in the conventional economics world, what the justification is? I mean, what's the social that the neoclassicals would come up with for a bond market, for example?
Equilibrium. It's so important. Markets, the invisible hand. You know,
right? The bond vigilantes.
Oh, sorry.
The bond vigilantes, right?
Yeah,
the bond vigilantes who bless the confidence fairy. I'm joking.
Exactly.
But
I know. Just rather than crazy. I mean,
so
it's a fantasy world.
Right.
And
so the bond vigilantes got slaughtered. Oh, hold it. The bond vigilantes got slaughtered by QE.
Yeah, and they don't exist anyway, so you can't kill them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Colin's point, the justification is that rich people hold most of the bonds. And if you think back to, if you're ever reading Pride and Prejudice, or, you know, similar books from 19th century romantics, a lot of the discussion was whether, I've forgotten the guy's name in Pride and Prejudice, but he's worth going because he got a lot of government bonds. And so what was seen, people thought they were financing government activity. The government was actually distributing money through the wealthy.
Right. Yeah, that's all it seems to be. That what the government's done is the service that they're providing is they're providing a place for rich people to park their money. That's safe.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah.
Because if you have more than $250,000, you can't. If you put that money in the bank, it's not insured, so you could lose it in theory.
Which is mad. I mean, they should insure the whole damn lot. That's what the crazy thing about Silicon Valley Bank. That's one reason it collapsed, because you got firms putting in $150 million, $2 billion, and $250,000 of it is insured. That's crazy.
Right.
Yeah? We should not allow deposits to fail. So other elements where people who don't understand the monetary system have set up the rules for the monetary system.
Right. Okay. Anybody else?
Anybody else? Yeah. All right, I'm going to finish dinner, and I've got to check. I really wasn't ready for today because I'm literally 15 minutes before we started, I was still trying to strangle Richard Toll. And I think that's an extremely decent social policy for me to undertake. So I'll get back to challenging the bastard, but I'll give myself at least half a day to read the next lecture. It might be a workshop. Take a look on School, and I'll check there as well. But it should say the curriculum, and maybe next week is a workshop. Whatever way, please download Minsky and/or Ravel, one or the other. You can't install both. One wipes out the other. Ravel is better, obviously. Install it, and I think I have a workshop next week. If we don't, you're ready for the week after that. Okay? All right, everybody. Good night.